Have I told y'all that a few months ago we got a puppy? Yeah. Say a little prayer for us, okay? In fact, it was just about a week ago that I was trying to watch a YouTube video and I got right to the interesting part when it stopped. And I said, hey, there's nothing more upsetting than when the Wi-Fi gives out, right? Nothing worse on planet Earth. And I heard from across the house one of our kids had also experienced the disconnection of the Wi-Fi, and we were trying to figure out, and it turns out that the puppy had pulled the Wi-Fi connector right out of the wall. And despite messing with it for about a half hour, we were unable to successfully restore the Wi-Fi, and so we said, what on earth are we going to do tonight? After all, it's dark at 4 o'clock. And so we went up in the attic. We pulled out the plastic tub full of DVDs. Now, for our teenagers, if you've never heard of DVDs, these are how we used to have to watch movies. Some of you were back there rolling your eyes and saying, whoa, we didn't even have cassette tapes when I was growing up. That's fine. And we have this small little collection of Christmas movies. And we decided that we would go back in time and watch one of the old Rankin-Bass stop-motion Christmas movies. Anybody like the old stop-motion Christmas movies? Well, I can tell that you haven't tried watching any of them this year, okay? They, for some reason, didn't quite pack the same punch as they did when I was younger. Nevertheless, there's a certain magic about these goofy little movies, isn't there? In fact, this one in particular, A Year Without Santa Claus, is one of the later movies that Rankin and Bass made. It was in 1974 that this one was released. Of course, it stars Mickey Rooney. And Santa, if you haven't seen it, has a cold, is discouraged, and he says, I'm going to go on vacation instead of delivering the presents this year. What a creative conceit for a movie. And so the elves panic. They have to go around the world and try to rally support and convince Santa to eventually give up the vacation, come back, and of course the world needs you. We can't have Christmas without you, in other words. They're going around trying to raise Christmas cheer because the whole conceit of the movie is we can't have Christmas without Santa Claus. Of course, we could argue about that all day here among the church, couldn't we? Nevertheless, it's with a similar sentiment that Paul writes 1 Corinthians 13. No, it's not because the puppy pulled the Wi-Fi out of the wall. It's not because this was the only Christmas movie that Paul could find to watch on this particular evening. But it's in 1 Corinthians 13 that Paul says there is one thing and one thing only that is essential in making the church what it is. Paul says that a church without love isn't just lacking in one critical area. Oh, we'll get by this year without love. Paul doesn't say that church without love is a church that's just a little bit weak in a particular area. And we'll put together a focus group, and we'll be able to put a team together and get some deacons on that, and maybe we'll get it figured out. Paul says that if we don't have love, we have nothing. 1 Corinthians 13 is one of the most beautiful, poetic, transcendent chapters in all of the Bible, if not in the history of human language. Even non-Christians can read 1 Corinthians 13 and say, hey, you're onto something there. That's beautiful. I have met atheists who have this tattooed on their body. Not the entire chapter. That would be quite the feat, wouldn't it? But a little line here or there about faith, hope, and love, or something like that. Even with as beautiful and as powerful and as poetic as this chapter is, brothers and sisters, it's also a sobering chapter for the church as well, isn't it? What if I told you that 1 Corinthians 13 isn't primarily about weddings? It's not primarily about romantic love shared between one human and another, but in its context, 1 Corinthians 13 gets to the heart of each and every issue that we have been examining in the book of 1 Corinthians, doesn't it? There's not a word said in this particular chapter about sexual immorality. There's not a word said about meat sacrifice to idols, and yet with each and every issue that has come up along the way, it all comes down to this. Brothers and sisters, 1 Corinthians 13 is the heart of what it is to be church. It's with that in mind that we're going to take a look at this text this morning. A text that's not primarily just something to be read and smiled about on our wedding days, but a text that we as the church have to revisit time and time again. A roadmap for what it is to be God's people and to navigate these crises that we can have from time to time in the church. Crises like they had in Corinth, and even crises that we might have today. I've got to admit, I spent a lot of time reading 1 Corinthians 13 this week thinking, what on earth can I say about 1 Corinthians 13 that you haven't already heard before? What on earth can I possibly say that's going to really bring this text to life? I know my little Santa story really did the trick, didn't it? Okay, maybe it was a stretch. What if I told you this morning that there's nothing I can possibly say that can elevate 1 Corinthians 13 more than what the Spirit of God has already put into words this morning? I want to let the text do the talking. You see, it's God and God's word that says this: if I speak in the tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all that I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, and have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So now, faith, hope, and love abide. These three. But the greatest of these is love. Of course, you know as well as I do that as these words are originally written, inspired by the Holy Spirit, preserved for us by Paul, this was not something that was one particular chapter meant to be taken out of context at the exclusion of where it belonged within the letter to the Corinthians. Of course, in its context, this comes right in the heart of Paul's message about spiritual gifts. That is, that there is an appropriate way and an inappropriate way to use our gifts in the church. We can use our gifts to show off and make a spectacle of ourselves to make others feel inferior, or we can use our gifts in a way that respects and honors and defers to one another, a way that elevates the lowly, a way that says it's not all about me, a way that sometimes we have to hold back and let others shine. And it's with all of this, with all of these issues that have come up one after another, the idolatry, the sexual immorality, the sweeping sin under the rug, you name it, they struggled with it in Corinth. And it's with all of this that Paul finally has to say, love is patient, love is kind. In fact, I could almost hear y'all thinking about singing it as we were reading from 1 Corinthians 13 a moment ago. You see, as we look at it in its context, what we find, of course, is that this is really the question, isn't it? What would the church be without love? Well, I saw on the internet this week that as there was a church that was planning their Christmas service coming up, they were saying, we're really going to pull out all the stops this year. We're going to do it bigger and better than before. And they had a big LED TV screen all the way across the stage. Really makes our poinsettias look a little bit sad. Actually, it looks gorgeous, doesn't it? It looks beautiful. Ocean did a great job in setting the stage for us as we enter the Christmas season. This particular church that I saw online, in fact, they had taken it to the next level. They had not one, not two, but 6, maybe 8 drummers suspended from the ceiling on harnesses, flying out throughout their auditorium, doing the little drummer boy or something like that. And now people in the comments, they were split. Some were saying, wow, you're really going to give God your best this year. And others were saying, what on earth is going on there? I got to admit, I kind of fall into the second of those two categories. Well, I can't comment on what makes up that church in terms of their day-to-day, their week-to-week, what it looks like for the poor among them. I can tell you it looks at least a little bit like there's some excess being spent on their Christmas service. I can say that much without reservation. You see, the church without love might be a show, but brothers and sisters, you know as well as I do that we can't quite keep up with Netflix or YouTube. In fact, the church without love might look like these showy actions that appear to be spiritual. In fact, when I was in Massachusetts trying to make friends among the pagans in our culture and getting to know my neighbors across the street and inviting them to church, I had one friend in particular who said, I've got to admit, I don't think that I could step foot in a church without it collapsing down around me. And I don't know if he meant that as an excuse to not have to go, or if somewhere deep down there was a genuine fear that church was this sacred, holy space that a sinner like him couldn't enter. Whatever the case was, he didn't have enough of an impression that church was a place where someone like him could come and learn and observe and be loved. What would church be without love? Well, Paul says, we look at all of these attributes of love, what love really looks like when push comes to shove. These things that, even his culture was lacking in their understanding of love. And he says that church can become envious, it can become boastful, it can become arrogant or rude. You fill in the blank. Ultimately misplaced values, easily discouraged. We might shine brightly for a moment, but don't have day-to-day faithfulness that can carry us through the worst of the worst. Brothers and sisters, one of the evil one's greatest accomplishments in our culture, and you know it as well as I do, is that we have such a distorted view of what love is, don't we? You see, as we read a chapter like this in 1 Corinthians 13, am I the only one who reads this and thinks, wow, have I got a long way to go in terms of living up to the love of God poured in our hearts through Jesus Christ? I read this and I think, maybe there's one of these that I'm doing okay on. And yet, this is the reorientation that Paul gives the church for what it looks like to have love in their midst. You see, our culture has such a distorted view of love that we have to be able to distinguish what love is from what love isn't. And once again, remember that I'm talking about primarily in the context of being God's people on earth, right? This is about being the church more than it is about navigating love lives. And yet our culture says love is all about warm, fuzzy feelings, isn't it? In fact, I don't want you to get me wrong. I love each and every one of you in a warm, fuzzy feeling kind of way. Okay, so much so that I have prepared personalized, handwritten love notes under each and every one of your seats this morning. Go ahead and take a look. No. This isn't to say that love is at the exclusion of having warm. How many of you looked? Okay. I know Aiden's just messing with me, but okay, a couple of you did. My wife said, I'm not sure if I would go with that joke. This isn't at the exclusion of feeling warm toward other people. Now, of course, it's better than feeling cold toward other people, but 1 Corinthians 13, this kind of love that Paul prescribes for the church isn't primarily this state of feeling good toward another. In fact, the way that Paul describes this is that it's a commitment, isn't it? A covenant that says, I've made a decision and I'm not going back on it. A love that keeps no record of wrongs means that there are wrongs in the first place. It's in our decision on what we're going to do about them. I've got a working hypothesis that there is only a 24-hour period that an avocado is actually ripe to eat. I don't even waste my money on avocados anymore. Well, there's the side of things that they actually give me heartburn. But long before I discovered that, I said, I'm not even going to waste money on these anymore because they're either too firm and inedible, or they are brown and disgusting. And there is this tiny window right in between, and it feels like it is impossible to hit that sweet spot when it comes to avocados. Well, brothers and sisters, this is what love is in our culture. It's this temporary, fleeting feeling of, well, we had it for a time, and then we grew apart. The kind of love that Paul prescribes for the church isn't just the kind of love that says, well, that church was really meeting my needs for a season or during that time in my life. Brothers and sisters, I've had to persevere with bodies of believers, even when there were weeks when I didn't want to see some particular people when I came to worship. There were seasons of life where people had hurt my feelings or my family's feelings, and we weren't real comfortable with showing up to church, and yet we made a commitment. Because the kind of love that is prescribed in 1 Corinthians 13 is more of a commitment than it is a feeling. It's also, notice this, not the absence of strife. I had a friend growing up who at one point my mom asked me, why, son, are you two such good friends? Why do you get along so well? And I said, you know what? We've just never had an argument. We've never really not seen eye to eye on anything. Whatever I'm thinking, he's one step ahead of me. He's already anticipating. He's thinking the exact same things I am. We have all of the same interests. We've never hurt each other's feelings. We always get along until, of course, we didn't. And then we began to have a little bit of strife. We began to butt heads here and there. And you know what? I think to this day, I would say he is still one of my best friends, not because of the absence of disagreement, but because we've gone through a lot of life together. Are you with me? Do you have people in your life like this? This is what love looks like, isn't it? Love when we have to forgive each other. Love when we have to say, you know what, we may not see eye to eye on this, but let's turn the page and move forward together. This is the kind of love that the church needed in Corinth, and the kind of love that the church needs today. Notice the way that Paul describes this in 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy or boast, it's not arrogant or rude, it's not irritable or resentful. See, this kind of love that Paul is describing is not to say that bad things don't happen, but then it's what we do when the bad things do happen. How can we make it through this as the body of Christ? Of course, we have to be able to distinguish the love that we see on TV versus the love that is written in 1 Corinthians 13, and realizing that it isn't also a temporary state of bliss. The way that Paul describes this is so incredibly transcendent, isn't it? And he talks about this issue of things passing away and being temporary. Going back to the avocado for a moment, what exactly is it that Paul is saying isn't as enduring as love? Well, we could have a lot of debate about this morning and what this looks like in terms of spiritual giftedness, which, of course, is the context of 1 Corinthians 13. But listen to this. He says, love never ends. After having just said that it bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Verse 8, love never ends. As for prophecies, there's one, they will pass away. As for tongues, there's another, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. Paul talks about how we know in part, we prophesy in part, we can interpret our reality to the extent that God has revealed it. We, of course, can understand that which we can understand because God has allowed us to comprehend the universe and the way that the world works and his plan for us and for all of creation. But at the end of the day, Paul makes the point that that's not primarily all of what life is about. It's not all about what we know. It's not all about how good we are or amazingly gifted we can be. Instead, he says that it is love that will be there on the other side of each and every one of these. Of course, commentators are split depending on their Christian tradition on whether or not this is talking about the passing away of miraculous spiritual gifts. I've got to admit, I do fall on that side of things in terms of how I understand the miraculous spiritual gifts that take place in the church today, or their lack thereof. Nevertheless, it's important that we can say it's not about us telling God where he can and can't go, what he can and can't do. What we can understand is what we can see and what's been revealed. And that is, love is not going to pass away, even when all these other things will. A couple of years ago, we had to suffer through Alzheimer's with my wife's grandmother. There was a time where we knew her memory had begun to decline. There was a time where we knew what was coming to a certain extent, and then there was the first time that she forgot our names. And then we had to hear from other family members about the first time that she forgot their names or where she was. And I don't know if there's anything we've ever gone through in life that was more heartbreaking than having to watch a loved one lose their memory, their knowledge. You know, what never left even to the day of her passing was her love and her joy. You see, when God puts his love into a person's life and they commit to it with all of their being and they allow God's love to define them, there is nothing that can take that away. This isn't just Paul trying to be poetic. This is the fabric of the universe, and brothers and sisters, it's the lifeblood of the church. Sometimes in counseling settings, if you're dealing with people who are having strife with one another, they're at odds about this or that, one of the best questions that you can ask, of course, is, well, what if everybody on earth, what if everybody in the family or everybody in the church acted like you're acting? What if everybody held the same opinions as you and they had the same daily routine as you and the same job as you and they were just clones of you? What would the world be like? It's kind of a scary question, isn't it? What if everybody in the world was like me? Well, brothers and sisters, what if everybody in the world began tomorrow to live out a little bit more of this kind of love that's described in 1 Corinthians 13? What would it look like if our church began to live more like this? What if our church was more patient and more kind, less envious, less boastful? What if we rejoiced with those who rejoiced with the truth, even sometimes if it's difficult to hear? 1 Corinthians 13 tells us of a love that sustains the church, even a church like Corinth, a church that is seemingly falling apart over any and every issue imaginable. And Paul says this is what can bring you back. This is what can sustain you. What would this look like for us to live out in the week-to-week life of our body? Well, we would bring our concerns to one another lovingly and in private when there are people who have crossed us or done us wrong, or perhaps even a sort of sin that you're concerned is leading them down the wrong path. Well, we would bring those concerns rather than sweeping them under the rug or rather than justifying them. And perhaps even as we saw in Corinth, celebrating them. We would solve our conflicts Jesus' way. And then when they're solved and they're resolved, we put them behind us rather than holding them against others for years. We would give each other the benefit of the doubt. If love is the lifeblood of the church, then we would persevere through hard times rather than say, well, I can always go somewhere else. You see, it begins to hit a little bit closer to home, doesn't it? At the end of the passage, Paul says, what if we strip away everything else? here's what's left. So now, if we can look past this problem and that problem and all the others, if we realize that so much of the world around us is going to pass away, isn't going to stand the test of time, what does? Well, Paul speaks of this triad, faith, hope, and love, and he then goes a step further to say, but the greatest of these is love. When I grew up in Oklahoma, there was always the possibility that you could lose all of your possessions due to a weather phenomenon known as the tornado. In fact, it was a number of years after we moved away that my hometown was hit hard. We got the report Sunday morning after the late night Saturday tornado had ripped through my hometown that some of our brothers and sisters in the church had, in fact, lost every possession to their name. They had managed to get down into the storm cellar and survive, but they were going to have to start over. We reached out to these families and say, hey, is there anything we can do to help? What do you need? Well, no, we live 400 miles away, but we'll be there tomorrow morning to help you rebuild if that's what you need. And it was one of the greatest lessons in love that I've ever heard in my life. See, this close family friend, they said, you know what, we might have lost the truck, we might have lost the TV, we might have lost the photo albums, but we have never felt God's love more strongly than we do now. Because we have had to have these exact three things. We've had to have faith that God was going to provide. We have to have hope that there's going to be a tomorrow. And that there is, in fact, more to this life than our possessions. And you know what? Most importantly, we had each other. We had the love that kept our family together, and nothing could take that away. A couple of years ago, I was talking with a friend who was struggling with church. He kind of felt like church wasn't meeting his needs. He felt disillusioned. He felt like people weren't listening to him and his perspective. He really didn't feel heard or understood. He was on the fringes. He felt neglected. His friends had left. He had trouble singing with the same kind of zeal that he once had. Have you ever been there? And I asked him, you know what? I'm proud of you for hanging in there and for continuing to show up and to worship and to study Scripture. But I've got to ask you, what is it that keeps you coming back? And his answer to me, I'll never forget. He said, do I give up on a family member who's dying? Or do I hold their hand lovingly to the end? Now, don't get me wrong. The point of this is not to say that I believe that the church is dying. Because of what we've just read here in 1 Corinthians 13, when love is at the heart of who we are and what we do, God can and will do great things through his people. But I have also seen that sometimes love isn't in our minds when we struggle week to week, when we're navigating issues as a church family, when we're making plans for the future. I've got to admit, I, like many of you, have scars from the church. Some of the most heartbreaking, ugly things I've ever experienced in my life, I'm sad to say, I've seen in church. I've had angry people throwing fits in the name of the Lord. I've seen sin swept under the rug, sides taken in politics that perseveres over the gospel. But I've also seen people sitting by the bedside of a best friend who was dying. I've also seen people give money that they really weren't sure how they were going to replenish in order to help a brother or a sister to make ends meet. I've seen the most encouraging, powerful, life-changing words spoken in love from one brother to another. I've seen people sacrifice in the most amazing ways I have ever seen, and I've seen it in church. You see, these ultimately compose what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 13, a church that comes back to what God has put in our midst, that only God can put there, and that no one can ever take away. Brothers and sisters, church has problems. 1 Corinthians as a whole certainly makes that clear. It's part of being in a sinful culture, dealing with sinful people, and showing them a better way, the more excellent way, that Paul is describing here. When we were in Massachusetts, we were trying to reach the pagans. I mean, I'm going to admit, as soon as we started to gain traction in our community, what we saw over the next year was we had a whole lot more problems as we had more people. You see, we had poverty. We had people desperate to make ends meet. We had people asking for assistance that the church really wasn't quite sure how we were going to be able to provide. We had biblical illiteracy. We had unplanned pregnancies, political friction, unpaid bills, car trouble, even harsh language on a Sunday morning. Can you believe it? Not from the pulpit, but this was the facts of dealing with a pagan people coming to understand who God was and what God's love looked like in their lives. Well, the Corinthians had sexual immorality and gender confusion and idolatry and class issues, even spirituality competition standing in the way of the gospel. And yet Paul says this is what it looks like to have God's love in our midst. It's not about the buildings or the stained glass or the programs or the food in our stomachs or the fancy signage, the nice polished clothes, or even the poinsettias on the stage. See, Paul says all of that amounts to nothing if we don't have love. I want you to take a look one more time with me here at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13. We're going to do something a little out of the ordinary, but I believe in you, okay? He says, if I speak in the tongues of men and angels and have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith so as to remove mountains but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all that I have and I deliver up my body to be burned and have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient and love is kind. And this is where Paul goes into the descriptions of the characteristics of love, but he started it out by saying, if we don't have this, then we have nothing. But notice, as we read 1 Corinthians 13 this morning, that's not where Paul leaves it, is it? He goes from nothing at the beginning of the chapter to where? At the end of the chapter, he talks about how if we have love, then we have everything. Take a look at this. Take a look at this. In verse 7, I want you to say it with me. I'm going to give the prompt, and you're going to say the words all things here so we can get the right verse up on the screen. All things are what we're going to say together as a congregation. So I'll say love bears, and then you'll say what? All. There you go. All right, quick learners. Love bears all things. Love believes. It hopes. And it endures all things. Love never ends. Paul, in Romans chapter 8, my favorite chapter of the Bible, he, of course, goes on from talking about the freedom that we have in Christ and the life in the Spirit. He goes on to say this, what shall we say again to these things? Verses 31 and 32, if God is for us, who can be against us? Listen to this. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? This is what God has given to the church. And with love, we can persevere through any situation, can't we? Interesting, isn't it, that there's no direct mention of God or of Jesus in 1 Corinthians 13. I'm not the first person to say this. In fact, it's popularly said that Jesus embodies each and every one of these characteristics spoken of about here. Jesus perfectly lived these things. He is the example to the church as we follow Christ as his disciples, walking in love as he did to the cross and beyond the grave. If you need to come to know more about this kind of love that is all things to the church, we'd love to go deeper into the Word of God with you this morning. If you need to know a love that is even greater than a faith that can move mountains, that's the love that God has made available to each and every one of us, the love that sustains the life of the church. If you need to come to know that love, why don't you come now this morning as we stand and sing.